Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad that you are here, and I am so glad that our guest is here with us. I'm going to introduce Nurya, but I'm going to give her as much time as we have, so I'm not going to say much about her, but I will say that if you were not here last night, and even if you were, it is absolutely worth going online and watching the presentation from last night. Last night, Nurya talked about the connection between discipleship, Christian faith, and environmental concerns. And what I took away from that class last night was a sense in why, as a person of faith, caring about the environment is not just something we do, it's central to who we are, and I appreciate that.
Sorry, I feel like my job here is done.
Today, Nurya will talk about what and how we might respond to that. But Nurya and I have known each other for about a decade or so, and her voice is so clear and compassionate, but also convicted, and she is very good at holding up to me and to others the importance of this work that we do. Nurya lives in western Michigan, outside of Grand Rapids, and she's going to talk a little bit about her ministry among us, but I'm really glad that you're here. Before I turn it over to Nurya, if you didn't get a little bio sketch, there's a basket of them as you walk in, and you will see a website for Plainsong Farms, and you'll hear about Plainsong Farms, and if you are captivated by that ministry, I'm sure that Plainsong Farms would be delighted to receive any donations that you would offer. So you can visit their website, you can learn about Plainsong Farms, and of course you can give to Plainsong Farms. And at the end of the presentation, or if at any point during your presentation, there are questions or comments, I'll come to you with a microphone. Nurya, we're glad you're here, and welcome.
Thank you so much. It has been such a treat for me to be here. And the hospitality and engagement and reverence and fun that pervades this parish is just a delight to be part of, even for a short period of time. And he just left because he's looking for a new battery because we're nervous that this one's not going to run out. But your rector is just, and the whole staff here could not have been kinder. And I can't start without expressing my gratitude. So if you were here last night, raise your hand. Okay, so about half and half. I think people that have heard the kind of the background of the why of Plainsong Farm, and people that I'm just going to plunge in to today, and so there's a lot of background. That was my coverage from last night. I want to talk to you this morning about Plainsong Farm and Ministry. We are an agency of the Episcopal Church that was incorporated in 2019. I'm going to just say that one more time. We are an agency of the Episcopal Church that was incorporated in 2019. And now here in this place, you are accustomed to being part of a parish of the Episcopal Church that I think is celebrating its 175th year or thereabouts. And I want to do two things. I want to thank you for all that you inherit from your ancestors, that in this generation you are examining and cherishing and carrying forward. And I'm going to assume that mostly this morning I'm talking to Episcopalians, and I'm going to say that new things are actually the charism that we inherit through the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives, but not necessarily something that our institutions are. And I think you guys might be an exception, actually, but most of our institutions are not necessarily awesome at fostering. So I will tell you a lot about Plainsong Farm and Ministry and the life that we have together, and I want you to know that it is a miracle. And the reason that I say that is God brought this work into being by calling me and then calling a lot of people alongside and with against most rational structures and infrastructures in our diocese, and this is being recorded, that's fine, and also the wider Episcopal Church, because we came to life at a time when the Episcopal Church was still trying to figure out how to start new things, and I would argue we still are. So, this picture that you see before you, I want to ask you to imagine it for a minute as if it didn't have any cultivated land. So where you see those rows of beautifully manicured crops, or they look beautifully manicured because it's a drone shot, and where you see the hoop house in the front, just imaginatively erase all of that and make it weed-filled and unkempt, and not looking like a working farm at all. And that is what it looked like in 2014 when I met my co-founders, Mike and Bethany Edwardson, who are these in this slide. And they are the ones who turned it from that unkempt mess into what it looks like. Oops, what have I gone? Oh, to what it looks like now. And there's a backstory to that. So as you're imagining this as a slightly less organized, in 2001, my husband and I were newlyweds, and we bought a farm, which was a pretty normal thing for middle-class descendants of European settlers to do who had read too much Wendell Berry. And as one did, when we were in our 20s and 30s, we thought maybe we would farm. And that turned out to not be true, but we didn't know that when we purchased 10 acres and a large barn and a 1914 bungalow. But because of, if you were here last night, you heard about my sense of dislocation growing up in Las Vegas, Nevada, where as a child I recognized that the lawn in my front yard did not fit with the desert that surrounded us. And I carried a lot of questions from my childhood through going to college and going to seminary and moving to Michigan as a church planter with the Unitarian Universalists. That's a whole other story. And so and that set of questions about how humans could wisely belong to places was what got me started reading Wendell Berry. And then Wendell Berry got me started going to sustainable agriculture conferences. And I thought that this was just my weird hobby because I was the only public person of faith at most of these sustainable agriculture conferences. It was before Barbara Kingsolver published Animal Vegetable Miracle, and it was before Michael Pollan published Omnivore's Dilemma. And those two books are already old by now. But I remember thinking about how food was what connected people and places inherently. And if we could be intentional about how was our food the thing that, as disciples, we theoretically we give thanks for as a gift from God. We say grace. Maybe not all the time, but at least in special times. And that food also connects us and can connect us to the place that we live. So I don't see this as being true in St. Paul's Fayetteville, but it is true in Western Michigan, my diocese, that I would go to church gatherings, and when I was in my 40s, I would be the youngest person there. But I would go to these sustainable agriculture gatherings, and I would be among the older people. Like I aged into being one of the middle-aged people in my sustainable agriculture world, while I stayed young in the church world. And it took me a while to understand what was going on. And again, I don't see this here, which is awesome, keep it up, but I was concerned about the Episcopal Church in Western Michigan. And how were we going to pass on the riches of faith and a relationship to Jesus Christ, and an understanding that Christ provides healing and hope for the world and invites us to participate in that healing and hope with our lives, if people weren't showing up at church to be part of that message and to be formed in it. And I started to wonder, well, would they come to a farm? Even if they don't, because I keep seeing people at this farming thing. So over time, as I was the person with my family who lived in this yellow house, God started to call me to see the place where I was living as a place where God could work. And I was influenced by the vow of stability from the Benedictine tradition. And so I decided it would be called Plainsong Farm. And that's all I had. By like 2012, 2013, every time I prayed, the words Plainsong Farm would show up in my brain or my soul or whatever that, I don't know how you locate that. And I had a sense of urgency that grew over time that I was going to not be keeping faith with God if I did not try to live into that invitation that I was receiving in my prayers. But I didn't know what I was doing or how to do it, and very quickly I tried, right after I read the book Soil and Sacrament, I tried to be a farmer. 3 weeks was how long it took me to figure out that that was not the life to which God had called me. And it wasn't that I wasn't like doing the things, it was that I was I ordered a flock of chickens and I planted a garden, but what I found was that I experienced a sense of being given life as I was engaging with people and tending organizations, and not when I was engaging with chickens and tending to plants. And this was an existential crisis for me, because I knew that God was calling me I felt that God was calling me to start something called Plainsong Farm. And I also had quickly discovered that actually I couldn't farm. And none of this is my script, but I'm just telling you the story. And so I prayed about it, and I said to God, God, if it is your will that Plainsong Farm come into being, and it needs farmers to live here, instead of me and my family, show us another place to live, and we will go. And I did not mention that to my husband. My husband had never wanted to move. We had been there for over a decade by then, and we had every once in a while talked about moving, and he was resolutely opposed in every single occasion. And so it was quite a shock to me when about 2 weeks after that prayer, he walked into the room where I was and said, hey, I found a piece of property that I think that we should look at. I think it might be a good fit for us. I still look back at that moment in my life and go, I don't know that I've ever received a clear answer to prayer in my entire experience. And so okay, honey, if you want to go do that, we can do that. And we went and we looked, and it met all of his criteria for where he would ever be willing to move if we moved, and it met all of my criteria because it was in accordance with my vocational crisis and also a fine place to live, and we moved. And then I went to a conference and met Sarah Nolan, who at that time was doing ministry called Abundant Table in the Diocese of Los Angeles. And she said, which was the closest thing that I could find to what I felt like might be happening. And she said, what you need to do is find a farmer and start a nonprofit. And I was like, actionable advice. And I started looking for farmers. And that is how I met Mike and Bethany. They were people that were graduating from a totally different strand of Christianity seminary. He was graduating with a master's in, integrated studies. And she had graduated from college, and they had gotten married. And they wanted to start a farm that was somehow connected to a church. And they were in their 20s at the time. And I knew from all of my sustainable agriculture conferences that the main issue for new, beginning, and marginalized farmers was access to land and access to capital. And so I knew, and they knew as they met me, that I was the fact that my family owned 10 acres and wanted there to be a sustainable farm on it was a match, and the fact that I felt called to start a farm-based ministry without being able to farm. As we started to talk to each other, we recognized that if we put everything that we had in one thing, we would have enough to begin. And when I say everything we had, I mean our dedication and our assets and our willingness to risk, because when you start something new, there's huge risk involved. So by May of 2015, I handed the keys to my house and $15,000 to Mike and Bethany, and they moved in and began Plainsong Farm with me. And at that time, the Episcopal Church there was no such thing as a Good News Gardens movement. In the Episcopal Church at that time, I felt like I was just headed off into the unknown, like Abram was when God called him to leave behind the things that were familiar to him and go to a place that he did not know. And I also knew that it was going to somehow engage young adults. And I am a big believer in don't do anything for somebody unless you do it with somebody. And Mike and Bethany were the with for me. By then I was definitely not a young adult. You can already see my hair turning gray. But they were young adults. And I felt if I listened well to them and to what they were seeking and what mattered to them, together we would find our way towards making a place where other young adults could experience something about a life of discipleship that they wouldn't know otherwise. And I remember the moment where I did hand over, that the keys to your house is not a small thing in my economic universe, and thinking that despite the fact that I had been in ministry for 20 years, this new thing that God was calling into being through me was already asking me to practice a more radical discipleship than I had ever practiced previously. In the book of Acts, we read that they had all things in common, and that's the early church. And I had not given all things, but eventually our family provided the use of that house to the Diocese of Western Michigan at no cost for 7 years. And I didn't know that was what we would be doing at the time, but I have no regrets about it because it taught me so much about what is of higher value than money. And it's freed me up in ways that I would have never had a chance to experience otherwise. And at the time, the Episcopal Church funded new ministry that wasn't like start a parish. $20,000 spread over 3 years. And our diocese didn't have any funding whatsoever for new ministry. So that's why I say God works miracles, because Plainsong Farm exists. We went from 3 people and $15,000, which is where we were in May of 2015, to hundreds of people are now involved in the life of Plainsong Farm, whether that's as program participants or supporters. And we have $300,000 in our budget, which is only God can do that. Okay, so at Plainsong Farm, let's see, where am I going? Our mission is to cultivate connections between people, places, and God. And that mission statement arose out of work that we did in our kind of founding group as more people came along. I didn't have those words when we started, but that's what I saw happening as people engaged with Plainsong. And it made sense to me. Polly Hewitt, who was one of our early founders, proposed the first version of these words. And when she said them, I thought, that's what religion's supposed to do. Religion, religare, that somebody that knows Latin knows this better than I do, but it refers to like the ligaments that connect bones and muscles to one another and that put the body together into one thing, is the same root word as the root word for religion. And in the process of becoming the descendants of European settler colonists, we kind of lost some touch points with the places and our relationship both to place and God. That we can't go back. There's some way forward, and we don't know what it is yet. And so cultivating those connections is our work, and cultivating a place where it's safe to ask strange and unusual questions as we seek those connections. As a living laboratory farm where all are welcome is what we do. And we eventually realized that our niche was to be a place. We're not a parish, we're not a church, we're not, there's a lot of things we're not, but what we are is a place, that 12 acres that turned into 2 houses, a place that nurtures belonging and the radical renewal of God's world. Radical meaning root, with the sense that there is at root a way to reimagine how humans are in creation that we don't know yet, but we need to let God help us find. So we are on land that was the land of the Anishinaabe peoples before it was settled by Europeans, and the Cortland Township, which is our legal entity, was settled in 1838. And you're going to see, I always show this slide because you see a lot of white people in the pictures, and that's because there's a lot of white people in North Kent County where we are. If you look up at this Rockford at the top of the screen, that's where we are, and it is a 90% white by census data, and so you will see a lot of white people come to Plainsong Farm because that's who's around. We see ourselves as a living laboratory, and our hope is to grow local resilience and equity, to explore what it means to practice faith in place, and to serve the health of all creation. And I'll tell you more about these pictures as I get into more of them. What we're trying to find a way towards is a Christianity that asks questions about how our tradition is complicit in the existence of injustice, and we're trying to find a way to acknowledge our own tradition's brokenness and need for healing, while also lifting up all that is good and holy in the teachings of Jesus, because I believe Jesus was God and came to reconcile God and humanity. And so I've experienced that. It's not just a theoretical belief for me. But at its root, we see the climate crisis as a crisis of culture. And at its root, we also see the root of the crisis of culture as a crisis of religion. Because in the 1400s and 1500s and kept on going, people who genuinely believed that they were following Jesus lost sight of what the tradition teaches us about who he is, that in him all things belong. All beings belong. All that have the breath of life, whether or not it goes in and out of human lungs, are reconciled through his work on the cross and his resurrection to begin again. And so we are trying to see differently what we inherit and offer some unique contribution to help others make their unique contribution towards the health and healing offered in Jesus Christ. So we do a lot of things to make that happen. First, we were actually a working farm, thanks to Mike Edwardson, who continues to be a core member of our staff and is now our director of farm-based programs. And with his oversight, we grow food for health equity and distribute it for community, and distribute it to the community at no cost. So this slide is actually an example of some of the diversity of produce in an August that we used to grow when we did a community-supported agriculture share. That's one of the ways we funded ourselves when we couldn't find other funding. And it kind of shows you an example of the diversity of crops that still grow at Plainsong today. At this point, we have two different kinds of growing fields. We have our production and we have our education. And our production is 100% oriented towards what are the needs of the food pantries that we supply. And our education is oriented towards what do people that are coming to us to learn about growing food, what might they be interested in learning about? I'm not going to be able to explain all of these things in the time that we have, so we're just going to keep going. And here's Mike dropping off a load of produce to the Grand Rapids Community College. We learned in actually 2020, just before the pandemic hit the United States, that our local community college had a number of students who struggled with food insecurity, and as a result, they had opened a food pantry. And the chaplain, we have a chaplain at our community college, not an Episcopalian, a Presbyterian, but we're friends, and she came to the farm, and said, would it be possible for you to provide fresh produce for this community food pantry because the students don't have access to fresh produce? And it was a perfect fit, their needs and our capacities, and the fact that we have a vocation for young adult ministry, all went together. And it was the last meeting we had before Michigan shut down was at the community college. And then that year we raised funds to be able to put up hoop houses, which extend the growing season in Michigan, so that we could distribute to them through the winter months, at least through December. And so this is Mike, this is the back of Mike, taking just this past summer a load of peppers and other fresh produce to the Grand Rapids Community College. Now, this is an example of the educational work that we do. This is a group of students with the Interfaith Youth Center. It's our local university has an interfaith center, and they host a summer youth camp, day camp. And we became a place that they brought youth to learn about Christianity, which was delightful. And so we provided those youth an opportunity not only to hear the why of Plainsong, but also to get their hands in soil, to plant out. We had them actually plant out lettuce. I don't think you can see that in this picture, but they are learning what is their place in creation, how does food connect them to that place, and how can they be part of supporting greater equity in their community in this kind of educational experience. And we went from, I'm totally off script because I'm mindful of time. We also put at the heart of our work since 2019 our young adult residential service learning program. In 2019, we did that as a summer experience and then affiliated it with the Episcopal Service Corps. This is from our cohort that just completed. The Episcopal Service Corps, if you know anyone between the ages of 21 and 30 who is committed to greater justice and compassion with their lives and might be intrigued with a year of residential service learning and intentional community, that's what Episcopal Service Corps offers. There are maybe only about 13 to 15 sites on a national level. None of them are funded through the Episcopal Church's budget. They all self-fund, and we are one of them. Our program begins in January and ends in October, and these are some of the participants from our last cohort, one who's being really excited about some beets that are coming out of the field, and then they also, they have 4 days of work, which they don't just do in our fields, they do in all of our organization. And with our community partners. But then they also have time to rest and to reflect and to experience a formation program as disciples and explore their questions, because not all of them are committed to Christianity. You don't have to be committed to Christianity to be part of the Episcopal Service Corps. You just have to be willing to be in an environment that uses Christian language and explore questions honestly. So they are a huge part of what we do. Now, this next couple of pictures are from a program that went on hiatus during the pandemic and that we are working to bring back. But it was brought to us by Elizabeth DeRuff, who's a priest of the church in California, and she works to plant heirloom wheat with groups of people for communion bread. And so she brought that program to us. And what you're seeing here is a group of people who are praying for the health of soil. And I, kind of managed this experience. I'm wearing this hat. You kind of can't tell who I am. And leading this group in prayer. And as we did this, I think this was 2017 maybe, 2018, I realized that I had been a Christian for a very long time, and I had never been led in a prayer for the health of the soil. And it struck me that that was missing from my life and from our tradition, because the health of the soil and the health of the water is the health on which all other life depends, including mine and yours. And so that's why I keep putting this slide in presentations, even though we haven't done exactly this since that moment. We have prayed over the health of soil in other ways, because it was such a powerful experience, and I commend it to you if you are ever finding yourself in a place where you have a garden. It's just perfectly wonderful to put your hand on the soil of that garden and pray for God's healing upon it. It connects everything, including us, and we depend on it for life. We ended up growing heirloom wheat in that field, and then this is a picture of the harvest. And what I love about this picture is that you can't tell this, so I have to tell you. The person in front is a United Methodist minister. Directly behind her is an Episcopal clergy person. Then the woman wearing the purple bandana is a layperson of the Episcopal Church, as is the person wearing the straw hat. And then the person in the yellow t-shirt is a Lutheran minister. And it kind of, I don't know whether it goes on like that, but so often on Sunday mornings, we are separated from one another by the decisions that were made 500 years ago. And yet all of us across these traditions profess to be disciples of Jesus Christ, in whom all things are one. I don't think there's anything wrong with celebrating the traditions we inherit in our denominations, but I do think there's something wrong about not having a field where we see what we hold in common. And literally, to me, this became that field. All of us who inherit the stories of Jesus inherit the tradition of taking bread into our body and remembering him. And so often, gladly not here, but so often that bread in the Episcopal Church is a small wafer purchased from the Kavanaugh Company, which celebrates on its website the fact that no human hands have touched that wafer. Which is not actually in accordance with the incarnation of Christ in the world and the theology that we profess. And so being able to see this field, the way that it brought all of us together across our traditions, the way that we, who were one body, would share in the one bread, even though, we had an amazing harvest. And then we didn't have enough of a harvest to supply all of these churches with all of their bread, but we blended the flour that we received into flour that we provided, and it did unify the churches in a way that they hadn't been unified before. And I continue to look at that and go, that was a moment when we were really Plainsong Farm, and now that we're not in this phase of the pandemic, how do we do that again? Because it was quite difficult. Another example of our life together is the Blessing the Fields liturgy that we do every May around the time of Rogation Days in the Episcopal tradition. And this is actually kind of an older picture. The person carrying the cross is now a priest of the church, and at that summer she was our intern. But I put it up because it reminds me to speak to the people that are behind, you can tell who I am in that. There's a high school student who heard our service learning invitation as part of his community service class that's at the local high school and decided he was interested in figuring out what a farm was. There's the person who was right behind him who literally said to me, I don't go to church, but this looked interesting. And that's, we have experienced that again and again, which it was a hypothesis when Plainsong Farm started. Maybe a farm will invite people into understanding discipleship who wouldn't come to a church. And I can now say that hypothesis, and I only have anecdotal evidence, but I have plenty, has proven to be correct. That a farm, because it produces food and everybody can relate to needing to eat, is a place of openness and hospitality when it's run on a nonprofit basis and supported by donations. That is engaging to people in ways that they just feel a sense of belonging to, no matter what their faith background or lack of faith background can be, which is an interesting ministry challenge. So this is the Blessing of the Fields of 2019. And what astonished me then, I was a church planter, my first call. And when you're a church planter, you step out in faith, trusting that the small number of people that you're working with is going to become, a larger number of people over time through God's grace. And in my first call, I started with, we had about 12 people when I was called to be their planter, and 4 years later, there were about 65 people. And that's neither here nor there, but this was 2019, and we had our very first Bless in the Fields service in 2017. And what we had started to do by then was a Sabbath at the Farm service. Let's see if that's the next slide. Yes, it is. And every summer, I saw more people come and find that to be a place for them. Hasn't been as true this year, but they found it to be a place for them, like over 12 weeks, there would be 50 people. And it just astonished me, especially because so often those people were people that were younger than the average age of Episcopalians in Western Michigan, and were interested in practicing faith in a way that connected to their desire to care for God's creation. They had a sense of, I relate to God outdoors, and you're outdoors, and I feel like it's important to take care of the earth. And here, you're telling me that it's important to take care of the earth. And I don't usually find that in groups of Christians. But you seem to be a group of Christians that thinks that way. And so I'm intrigued by what this is, because it's different from what I'm used to. We continue to hold Sabbath at the Farm liturgy, so this is from this past summer. And one of the charisms that we have discovered that we have is helping young people who are experiencing a sense of call to similar ministry than what we create at Plainsong. So this young man in the front of this slide is Nick. He was our seminary intern for this summer. He is discerning ordination as a Lutheran, ELCA, but he came to us from Princeton Theological Seminary, which also started a farm at the same time we started a farm. It's called the Farminary, and that's a whole other story that's not mine to tell. But it has been fascinating to see at various seminaries around the country farm projects start up. The Farminary started at Princeton. Methodist Theological School of Ohio started Seminary Hill Farm. Duke has a farm, and I think Yale has a farm. It's just like, I don't know what God is doing, but God is doing something with this connection between how is faith practiced, how do we eat, and how do we care for creation. And I say all of that as questions on purpose, because I think as people of faith, we don't actually have answers to those questions yet. We just can tell that those questions are related. I'm completely off script, but I will also say we can tell those questions are related in part because of how we worship, especially in this church, the Episcopal Church. What do we do every time we celebrate Holy Eucharist? We eat. It's at the center of our life together. And it should be, it's, I think, meant to open our eyes to those connections throughout all of our life. As I said, this summer, our Sabbath at the Farm was it's like varied between like 20 and 40 all summer long. But what we also saw this was the summer that people visited us from far away. Episcopalians from Massachusetts. Hey, we want to do something kind of like what you're doing. How does it work? Oh, Episcopalians from Texas. Oh, we're kind of interested in we feel called to do something. How does it work? So even though we were a smaller circle, we were a circle that had people kind of come in and out in ways that continue to astonish me. This is an example of, I should go back and say another thing about Sabbath at the Farm. So Sabbath at the Farm, it goes from June through August, so it's like a summer chapel experience. My bishop has given me permission, so it is fine for me to say it's not a liturgy experience of the Episcopal Church as we would recognize it. As an Episcopal priest, I personally think about it as a discipleship formation. However, I know my Mennonite colleague, who is our faith-based programs director, experiences it as a worship experience. I don't really care. Every time that we gather, we read from the Bible. We always have our kids with us the whole time. We always have a hands-on activity that connects from the scripture to our lives and is accessible to people of all ages. We always pray and we always eat. And so this is an example of us eating at the picnic tables as part of that Sabbath at the Farm experience. And it's always outside. That to me was obvious. Another example of some of the visits work that we do is this one. This is from just 2 weeks ago, when we had churches from the Diocese of Chicago send their youth groups to Plainsong Farm. And so about 20 youth came to Plainsong, and they were welcomed, and then they were invited into a prayer walk experience, which I don't have any pictures of, so I'm just going to have to tell you about it. They went to 3 different kind of prayer stations on the farm, and at one of the stations, they got the piece of scripture about how God made plants with seeds in them from Genesis, and they got a little saucer of wheat. It was einkorn, one of the most ancient wheat seeds, and they were invited to read the scripture, hold the seed in the palm of their hand, kind of ponder the mystery of a seed. I think there was also something on there about how seeds work. And plant that seed as part of a new planting of heirloom wheat for the farm. And then at another one of those stations, they got it was kind of muddied mud clay, that was from a section of more clay soil, and read, I think they actually read the Genesis section that we talked about last night in Genesis 2, where God makes humans from the soil of the ground. And and also the section in, I think it's Jeremiah, where God says, I've shaped you like a potter has shaped clay. And then they were invited to make of that clay something. And while they did that, to ponder how they were loved and how God had made them to be beloved as one with the earth, and that God breathed life into them. And then they left their clay creation behind. And I'm not going to remember the third station, but it was fascinating to watch and participate as this group they were rambunctious when they got there. I mean, they were no offense to middle and high schoolers. I appreciate that you have more energy than I do. But they were rambunctious when they arrived because they had been cooped up in cars for a couple hours. And then they went through this prayer walk experience. And then by the time they got to this reflection circle, which you can't see them, but that's what the rest of this circle is that I'm celebrating Eucharist with, they were calm. It was like, we are here. We have thought about the big things. We are ready to engage in a sacred experience. And I was like, this works. We like this. We're going to do this some more. And so we reflected together on that experience, and we celebrated Holy Eucharist. And then the next day, they came back and they volunteered in the Nourish Your Neighbor program, which gets them out, putting hands in the soil, understanding where their food comes from, and making a difference for health equity and resilience in our local community. And then the last couple pictures are the national level work that we do. And this is from our Churchlands cohort of 2020. This is a January 2020 picture where my colleague, Daryl Harris, who's now a newly minted PhD at Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, is leading a Bible study with a group of Episcopalians who will have gathered to think about how can the land that they tend as churches be more effectively held for the purposes that the presiding bishop outlined to us: racial justice and reconciliation, care of creation, and evangelism. Because land can help in those efforts in so many ways. Land is inequitably distributed in the United States, in part because of decades of unjust policies that were held at the federal government level. And so if we as Episcopalians have land that we are not utilizing, either making that land available as free leases for people who are marginalized or new farmers, there are congregations and there are places that are considering a land back movement where land is returned to the original people who inhabited it. And then there's also just something as simple as the Good News Gardens experience that the Episcopal Church is cultivating right now, where congregations grow and give food away and, plant, pray, and proclaim. All of these, the ways that you can, as a congregation, and maybe not here, you don't seem to have a whole lot of land, but you do have a camp and conference center, I've heard. So just ponder the possibilities at your camp and conference center for this work. Because when you care for land in a way that cares for creation, and you are open to doing that with others, it is amazing the rich partnerships that you can create. I am going to say this even though I know I'm on the record. We got way more help in our startup phase from our watershed agency than we got from our diocese. And I say that with grief, but I also say it with incredible gratitude. Our watershed agency understood the why of what we were seeking to accomplish and pitched in immediately with help and assistance. And it wasn't our diocese's fault that they didn't know what we were doing. They just didn't know. The watershed agency, the soil conservation agency, these wider bodies want to partner with people of faith for the health of God's creation. Even if they're not going to use that language, they will show up for partnership activities for land-based ministry. So again, as I was saying but as Christians, we have to root our why in the stories of Scripture. Oh, I'm going to run out of time. Okay, then I'm just going to show you this last picture. And then I think I'm running out of time for Q&A, and I'm really not happy about that. This is from the most recent expression of this work, which was our Ministry Innovators cohort of 2021-22. And I started this program remembering how hard it was when we began and knowing that there had to be other people doing similar work that were having the hard time that we had when we started. And indeed, they showed up. There's about half Episcopalians, half ecumenical friends in this cohort. And they were so grateful to know each other, to know they weren't alone, and to know that creating an ecological ministry is work that matters now and that there is practical help, even if they're not necessarily getting it in their denominational context. And so with that, I leave you with the thought that soil is holy. This is a piece of art from our 2019 cohort, and I invite you to look at the soil that sustains your life with new eyes, recognizing that it is one with who you are, and be grateful for the gift of life that God gives you, and imagine what God can do as you tend the life that you have. That is all. It's 10:48. So, and I wouldn't be who I am without inviting you to become a supporting member of Plainsong Farm.
Thank you. We've got time for one or two questions or comments before some of us scurry to the service. Here's Richard. Yes?
I can hold the microphone. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That's actually pretty inspirational and such a cool way to help grow the church and bring people back and get them to think about where our food comes from. I noticed you had some music there. What is the importance of music in your work?
Oh, what a great question. We have had actually music kind of at the heart of what we do for a long time without being intentional about it. And your question makes me realize that. So Mike and Bethany composed a song at the beginning of our life together that we still sing. It's called The Gathering Song, and it is now cross-pollinated to it's cross-pollinating, as songs tend to do. It's a paperless music is what we tend to use. So we do a lot of kind of call and response singing and zip singing. because we try to keep things simple enough that somebody that's showing up for the first time can be easily taught and join right in. And that kind of expresses the ethos that we have.
Who else has a question or comment?
That can't be the only one.
What would you say to Episcopalians in a place like this? What are one or two ways that a congregation can help get in touch with the relationship between farming, food, climate, and discipleship, other than supporting ministries and agencies like Plainsong Farm? What's one thing that we as individuals or a congregation can do to help us sense and experience those connections the way that you're inviting people to do at Plainsong?
That's a beautiful question. Thank you. I would suggest start by listening to each other, because you already have people in this congregation that are doing this work and you don't know it. I mean, that's what we found when we started working with congregations in the beginning of the pandemic. We hosted the Good News Gardens program for our diocese and supported them. And what we found was in every congregation, there were farmers and there were environmentalists, there were gardeners, there were already people doing the work of caring for creation in their place, but they didn't know that that was something that the church would celebrate, because largely the church had not celebrated it. So I am confident that you already have this work happening at St. Paul's Fayetteville in your local community as part of your watershed group or as part of your soil health initiatives, whatever it is. But I would strongly encourage you to find each other and then ask yourself the question, what could we do together that we haven't been able to do because we weren't doing it together before? And if you do those two things, you will answer that question for yourself much better than I can answer it for you.
Thank you. Let's say thank you to Nurya for being with us. Don't forget to visit plainsongfarm.com and support this wonderful ministry. Thank you.